Socialism begins as an idea before it becomes a movement, an answer to the question of how people might live together with justice and dignity. In the shadow of the Industrial Revolution, cities swelled, fortunes were made, and poverty deepened. Philosophers and workers alike confronted a world in which wealth clustered in few hands while multitudes toiled for little. Out of this landscape emerged a vision grounded in equality, collective ownership, and the conviction that society could be organized for the common good rather than private profit. Socialism, in its many forms, is both critique and proposal, a response to the realities of capitalism and a blueprint for a different order. To understand socialism is to enter a conversation about property, power, and the meaning of freedom. It is to weigh the claims of the individual against those of the community and to ask what justice demands from us all. Long before the word socialism entered common usage, thinkers and dreamers grappled with visions of a more just and cooperative society. The intellectual foundations of socialism stretch back centuries, even millennia, before the industrial towns and factories that would later give the movement its urgency and form. In the ancient world, the seeds of collective social thought could be found as early as Plato's Republic. In this seminal philosophical work, Plato outlined an ideal society in which property and even family ties were shared among the guardian class, aiming to reduce personal ambition and foster unity. Though far removed from later socialist projects, Plato's exploration of collective living set a precedent for imagining alternatives to individual ownership and private wealth. Centuries later, in 16th century England, another compelling vision emerged in Thomas More's Utopia. More's fictional island society abolished money and structured its life around communal sharing and cooperation. Utopia presented a dream of collective well-being, challenging the growing inequalities and social divisions of More's own era. While these early philosophical explorations did not call themselves socialist, the term had yet to be coined. They laid important conceptual groundwork. They considered the possibility that society could, and perhaps should, be organized around principles of equality and shared responsibility rather than competition and private accumulation. It was not until the early 19th century, however, that socialism began to take shape as a distinct philosophy and political movement. The catalyst for this emergence was the dramatic transformation brought on by the Industrial Revolution. Across Europe, and especially in Britain, new technologies and modes of production were reshaping work, wealth, and daily life. Factories rose in crowded cities, drawing masses of people from the countryside in search of employment. While industrial capitalism created great wealth for some, it also produced stark inequalities, suffering, and social upheaval for many others. The working-class men, women, and children often toiled long hours in dangerous conditions for meager wages, with little security or recourse. It was in this crucible of change and conflict that socialism first found its modern voice. Early socialists, witnessing the widening gulf between rich and poor, began to critique the capitalist system itself. They argued that the root of society's problems lay in the private ownership of the means of production: factories, land, machinery, and resources, which allowed a small minority to profit from the labor of the many. Socialism, at its core, offered a sharp contrast to the dominant values of capitalism. Where capitalism was built on private ownership and the pursuit of individual profit, socialism advocated for collective control and a commitment to serving the needs of the whole community. By the 1830s, the word socialism entered public discourse. It denoted a system of thought and practice distinctly opposed to capitalism, emphasizing group or public ownership and the regulation of economic activity for the benefit of all. Socialism's foundational concepts took clearer shape during this time. Central to its vision was the principle of equality, the conviction that all people should have an equal claim to society's resources and opportunities. Alongside equality stood the idea of collective ownership, the belief that the means of production should be held in common or managed by society as a whole. Early socialists thus challenged the institution of private property, particularly as it applied to productive assets, arguing that such ownership concentrated power and wealth in the hands of a few to the detriment of the many. This critique of private property, however, was not a call for the abolition of all forms of ownership. Instead, socialists focused on property that generated income and shaped the structure of society: factories, mines, land, and major enterprises. By transferring ownership or control of these resources to the community, socialists believed it was possible to eliminate exploitation and foster cooperation. In place of a system driven by competition and the profit motive, they envisioned one organized around social welfare and mutual support. The rise of socialism was closely tied to the experiences and aspirations of the working class. As industrialization advanced, workers found themselves increasingly alienated not only from the products of their labor, but also from each other and from any meaningful control over their lives. Socialists responded by proposing alternative models of social and economic organization grounded in cooperation rather than rivalry. They called for new arrangements that would address the causes of poverty and inequality at their root, rather than merely treating their symptoms. Socialism, as it gathered momentum, was never a single, rigid doctrine. Its early proponents came from diverse backgrounds and offered varied visions for the future. What united them was a shared belief that the prevailing system was both unjust and unsustainable, and that a more humane and democratic order was possible. The movement encompassed a spectrum of ideas, from utopian projects that imagined entirely new forms of communal living to more pragmatic proposals for reforming existing institutions. At its core, socialism rested on a handful of key principles: equality, collective ownership, solidarity, and democracy. These values shaped both its critique of capitalism and its vision for a better society. Socialists argued that true freedom required not just formal rights, but also genuine economic security and the ability to participate in making the decisions that affected one's life. Solidarity, the sense of unity and mutual responsibility among people, was seen as essential to overcoming the divisions and antagonisms fostered by competition. And democracy, understood not only as political participation but as a means of organizing economic life, was central to the socialist ideal. A significant aspect of socialism's philosophical foundation was its emphasis on the collective good over individual profit. Socialists maintained that resources and industries should serve the needs of all, rather than enriching a privileged few. This was not simply a matter of economic efficiency, but a moral assertion that society had a duty to ensure the well-being of its members and that the fruits of collective effort should be shared fairly. The debates that shaped socialism's early development were wide-ranging and at times contentious. Foundational questions included the nature and scope of social ownership. Should it be state-run, cooperative, or communal, as well as the means by which a socialist society could be achieved. Some envisioned gradual transformation through democratic reforms and the expansion of social welfare, while others insisted that only more radical change could overcome the entrenched power of capital. These debates reflected the flexibility of socialism as a philosophy, capable of adapting to different social, cultural, and geographic contexts. Despite this diversity, socialism consistently asserted the moral and economic superiority of collective ownership. Its advocates contended that capitalism, by concentrating power and wealth, undermined democracy itself. Economic resources, when controlled by a few, could distort the political process and subvert the common good. Socialists thus saw their project as inseparable from the struggle for a more inclusive and participatory democracy. The contrast between socialism and capitalism were, and remain, striking. Where capitalism was organized around private interests and the relentless pursuit of profit, socialism sought to orient economic life toward shared goals and needs. Where capitalism produced inequality and division, socialism aspired to foster equality and cooperation. Proponents of socialism believed that only by addressing the structural sources of exploitation and alienation could real freedom and justice be achieved. It is important to recognize that socialism, from its earliest days, was shaped by the conditions and struggles of its time. The movement arose in response to the unprecedented changes wrought by industrialization, urbanization, and the emergence of a wage-dependent working class. These upheavals gave urgency to the call for alternatives and lent weight to the critiques of private property and capitalist accumulation. Socialism's history is thus inseparable from the broader story of modernity and the search for a more just and equitable society. At the same time, socialism has always encompassed a rich and varied tradition of thought and practice. There is no single universally accepted definition of socialism. The term has been used to describe a wide range of ideas, institutions, and movements. This diversity is part of socialism's strength, allowing it to respond to changing circumstances and new challenges, even as its core principles remain constant. In tracing the foundations of socialist thought, we see a philosophy that is both a critique and a promise. A critique of the forms of power and exploitation that have marked human societies, and a promise that another way is possible. Socialism invites us to imagine a world in which the basic goods of life are shared more equally, in which cooperation is valued over competition, and in which the dignity and freedom of every person are defended not only in word, but in deed. The foundational debates that began in the early 19th century continue to resonate today. Questions of ownership, control, and the distribution of resources remain central to ongoing discussions about the shape of our economies and societies. Socialism, in all its forms, asks us to consider what kind of world we wish to build together and what principles should guide us as we strive for justice, equality, and solidarity. Though the context has changed, the core insights of socialism, its commitment to equality, its critique of private property, its vision of collective ownership for the public good, remain vital touchstones in contemporary debates. Whether as a guiding philosophy, a political program, or a source of inspiration, socialism continues to challenge us to confront the realities of inequality and to imagine new possibilities for human flourishing. This chapter has only begun to outline the philosophical roots and enduring ideas that animate socialist thought. As the story unfolds, we will see how these foundations have been developed, contested, and transformed by generations of thinkers, activists, and ordinary people seeking to create a more just and humane world. The journey into the heart of socialism is, above all, an exploration of the ways in which human beings have sought to balance freedom and equality, individuality and community, hope and struggle in the ongoing project of social transformation. It is one thing to imagine a more just society, it is another to chart a path toward it. The journey of socialist philosophy, after its earliest stirrings, unfolded along several major currents, each shaped by distinctive assumptions about human nature, history, and the means by which a fairer world might be achieved. To understand the evolution of socialism, one must enter the workshops of its leading thinkers, visionaries, and critics who debated not only the ends of social change, but also the best tools for building them. In the decades following the birth of the term socialism, a group of thinkers emerged with bold, often sweeping visions for the future. Figures such as Robert Owen, Charles Fourier, and Henri de Saint-Simon are now often called utopian socialists. Their work was marked by a conviction that cooperation could replace competition as society's guiding principle. These early socialists were driven by ethical appeals and a belief in the perfectibility of human arrangements. They imagined communities organized around shared ownership and collective well-being, sometimes offering elaborate blueprints for how people would live, work, and relate to one another. Robert Owen, a Welsh industrialist, did not merely theorize about these ideas, he put them into practice. In the Scottish village of New Lanark, Owen transformed a cotton mill community into a site of social experiment. He shortened working hours, improved housing, provided education, and promoted communal welfare. Owen's reforms aimed to show that industry could operate on cooperative rather than exploitive lines, and that moral improvement followed from better social conditions. His work inspired similar ventures elsewhere, though most of these experiments ultimately faced daunting economic and social challenges. Charles Fourier, a French contemporary of Owen, envisioned a society organized into phalansteries communities structured to harmonize human passions and eliminate poverty. Fourier's vision was exuberant, picturing a world where work was a source of pleasure and social conflict was dissolved through communal living. Meanwhile, Henri de Saint-Simon, another French thinker, proposed reorganizing society along rational, scientific lines, with productive labor as its highest value and leadership entrusted to industrialists and scientists dedicated to the common good. St. Simon's ideas anticipated later debates about planning and expertise within socialist philosophy. Though their projects differed in detail, these utopian socialists shared a belief that social harmony could be achieved by designing better institutions and appealing to the conscience of the powerful. Their critics, however, would later challenge the practicality of their proposals. For many thinkers who followed, utopian socialism's reliance on goodwill and ethical reform seemed insufficient to overcome the entrenched interests of wealth and power. One such critic, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, added a distinctive voice to early socialist philosophy. Proudhon argued that belief itself is inherently social, that our ideas and values arise not from isolated individuals, but from our interactions within communities. His critique of private property went hand in hand with an emphasis on collective organization. Proudhon's influence extended beyond France, helping to shape strands of socialism that prioritized mutual aid, voluntary association, and the primacy of the collective over the individual. As the 19th century unfolded, new and sometimes clashing schools of thought emerged from these foundations. Among the most influential was anarcho-socialism, championed by figures like Mikhail Bakunin. Anarcho-socialists rejected the state as inherently oppressive and argued for the abolition of both private property and centralized authority. Bakunin and his followers called for a society organized through federations of autonomous communities, where cooperation would arise organically rather than through state decrees. This current of thought emphasized direct action and the dismantling of hierarchical structures, setting it apart from those who believed a strong state was necessary for social transformation. In contrast, another branch of socialism, state communism, advocated for temporary, centralized control as a means to overcome the power of capital and lay the groundwork for equality. This approach would later find expression in Marxist-Leninist theory which envisioned a period of revolutionary transition in which the state would play a leading role in reorganizing society before ultimately withering away. The tension between these currents, one skeptical of all authority, the other willing to wield it in pursuit of social ownership, would become a defining feature of socialist debates. It was in this context of ferment and contestation that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels rose to prominence. Marx and Engels did not simply add another variant to the growing list of socialist philosophies. They sought to recast socialism itself as a scientific enterprise, anchored in rigorous analysis of history, economics, and society. Drawing on French socialist ideas, German philosophical traditions, and English political economy, they developed what became known as Marxist theory, a framework that would redefine the trajectory of socialist thought. Central to Marx's philosophy was the concept of historical materialism, the idea that the organization of society and the course of history are shaped by material conditions and economic relationships. For Marx, the driving force of history was the struggle between classes, each defined by its relation to the means of production. In this view, capitalism was not simply unfair. It was inherently unstable and exploitative, producing wealth for a few while alienating and impoverishing the many. Marx's critique of capitalism went beyond the moral appeals of earlier socialists. He argued that capitalism's very structure separated workers from the products of their labor, from each other, and from their own potential. The factory system, in his analysis, turned workers into mere appendages of machines, rendering them powerless and estranged. This alienation, Marx contended, was not an accidental byproduct, but a fundamental feature of the capitalist system. Friedrich Engels, Marx's close collaborator, played an essential, though sometimes underappreciated role in developing and disseminating these ideas. Engels was not only a theorist, but also a practical organizer and popularizer. After Marx's death, Engels edited and published the later volumes of Das Kapital, ensuring that Marx's economic analysis would reach a wider audience. Engels also contributed his own analyses, clarifying and expanding on Marxist theory in both theoretical writings and polemical pamphlets. Together, Marx and Engels produced works such as the Communist Manifesto, which distilled their arguments into a form accessible to workers and activists across Europe. One of their key contributions was the distinction between utopian and scientific socialism. Marx and Engels contended that earlier socialists, for all their moral fervor, had failed to grasp the decisive role of class struggle and material conditions. They insisted that socialism must be grounded in the actual dynamics of society, the conflicts and interests that shaped everyday life, rather than abstract ideals or blueprints for perfect communities. In their view, it was not enough to imagine a better society. It was necessary to understand how capitalism worked, why it produced inequality, and how its own development might point toward its eventual transformation. These debates were not confined to the study or the pamphlet. Socialism, even in its formative years, inspired political movements, labor organizations, and experiments in governance. One of the most celebrated and controversial episodes in socialist history was the Paris Commune of 1871. For a brief but consequential period, Paris was governed by an elected council that introduced radical reforms, equalized pay for public officials, secularized education, and greater participation in decision-making. Although the Commune was ultimately suppressed, it became an enduring symbol for socialists of what might be possible when ordinary people seized control of their own lives. As the decades passed, socialist thought continued to evolve and diversify. Some thinkers and activists remained committed to revolutionary change, while others began to explore the possibilities of gradual reform within existing political systems. Out of these discussions, a significant new current emerged: democratic socialism. Tracing its roots to the ethical concerns of 19th-century utopians and the mass mobilizations of the British Chartist movement, democratic socialism sought to achieve social ownership and equality through democratic means rather than violent upheaval. The Fabian Society in Britain became one of the leading proponents of this approach, advocating for the steady, incremental extension of social ownership and welfare within a parliamentary framework. Eduard Bernstein, a German theorist, developed what he called evolutionary socialism, arguing that the path to a just society lay through persistent reforms and the cultivation of democratic institutions. For Bernstein and like-minded social democrats, the experience of working-class political participation suggested that socialism could be built within and not just against the structures of representative government. This was not a mere tactical disagreement. The question of whether socialism required the overthrow of the state or could be achieved through its transformation became a central axis of debate. Revisionists like Bernstein challenged certain Marxist predictions about the inevitability of revolution and the collapse of capitalism, emphasizing instead the adaptability of both capitalism and democracy. Social democrats such as Sidney Webb further developed these ideas, seeking to reconcile socialist goals with pluralism, legal rights, and political freedoms. Meanwhile, other voices continued to push socialist thought in new directions. Anarchists like Bakunin and Peter Kropotkin insisted that true liberation was impossible so long as any form of coercive authority persisted, whether capitalist or socialist in name. They championed decentralized voluntary associations and mutual aid as the building blocks of a cooperative society. The history of socialism thus became a tapestry of competing schools, some emphasizing the state, others its abolition, some advocating revolution, others reform. Through the 20th century, these currents did not remain confined to theory. Socialist ideas inspired mass movements and revolutions across the globe, most notably in Russia, where the Bolsheviks, drawing on Marxist-Leninist principles, seized power in 1917. The establishment of the Soviet Union marked a turning point, as state communism became both a model and a point of controversy for socialists worldwide. For some, the Soviet experiment demonstrated the transformative potential of socialist planning. For others, it illustrated the dangers of centralized control and the suppression of individual and democratic rights. Socialist thought also proved remarkably adaptable, expanding its concerns in response to new historical realities. As the 20th century progressed, socialists engaged with issues of colonialism, gender, race, and ecology, recognizing that the struggle for justice could not be reduced to class alone. The international dimension of socialism found expression in institutions such as the First and Second Internationals, which attempted to coordinate left-wing movements and foster solidarity across national boundaries. Today, the legacy of these thinkers and movements is visible not only in the policies and institutions shaped by their ideas, but also in the ongoing debates that animate socialist philosophy. Whether one looks to the cooperative experiments of Owen, the theoretical framework of Marx and Engels, the radical democracy of the Paris Commune, or the gradual reforms championed by Bernstein and the Fabians, the major currents of socialism reveal a tradition that is both internally diverse and persistently engaged with the question of how to achieve a more just, equal, and democratic society. Through their arguments, their experiments, and their enduring disagreements, socialist thinkers have left a rich and dynamic heritage, one that continues to provoke, inspire, and challenge those who seek to imagine a better world. In any living tradition, periods of certainty are rare. Socialism, perhaps more than most political philosophies, has spent much of its existence in a state of argument with itself, with its adversaries, and with the changing world. The vigor of these debates has ensured that socialism has never been a static doctrine. Instead, it has continually redefined its own boundaries, wrestling with the meaning of equality, the mechanisms of cooperation, and the practical realities of building a just society. To understand socialism's place in today's world, it is essential to appreciate the internal debates that have shaped it, the critiques it has faced from opponents, and the ways in which it continues to adapt to new challenges and aspirations. At the heart of socialism's internal discourse lies a set of questions that remain as unresolved today as they were a century ago. Chief among these is the socialist calculation debate, a controversy that first emerged in the early 20th century and continues to cast a long shadow. This debate centers on whether it is truly possible to coordinate a complex, modern economy without the price mechanisms and signals provided by markets. Skeptics argue that central planners, no matter how well-intentioned, cannot adequately gather and process the vast amount of information required to allocate resources efficiently. Without prices set by supply and demand, they contend, it becomes nearly impossible to determine what should be produced, in what quantities, and for whom. Socialists have responded with various models, including decentralized planning, democratic oversight, and even computer-assisted calculations to address these concerns. Yet, the calculation debate remains a touchstone, prompting ongoing reflection about the feasibility of large-scale economic coordination under socialism. Another fault line runs through the question of method. Should socialism be achieved by revolutionary means, a forceful, abrupt rupture with existing structures, or through parliamentary incremental reform? This divide has not only shaped socialist parties and movements, but also influenced the trajectory of entire nations. Revolutionary socialists insist that the entrenched power of capital will never willingly concede its privileges and that only a decisive break can clear the path for a new order. In contrast, parliamentary socialists argue for working within existing democratic institutions, gradually building support and enacting reforms that expand social ownership and welfare. This debate is not merely tactical. It reflects deeper philosophical disagreements about the nature of power, the risks of violence, and the role of democracy in social transformation. The tension between these approaches has fueled both creative synthesis and bitter division within the socialist tradition. Perhaps nowhere is this spirit of contention more vividly displayed than in the ongoing discussion about the relationship between socialism and capitalism. For fundamentalist socialists, including figures like Marx and Engels, the two systems are inherently incompatible. One must ultimately replace the other. They argue that attempts to reconcile the two will inevitably dilute the transformative aims of socialism, leaving the basic structures of exploitation intact. Yet, revisionists such as Anthony Crosland and Anthony Giddens have challenged this orthodoxy. They maintain that elements of socialism can coexist with, or even enhance, aspects of capitalism. By advocating hybrid systems where public and private ownership, market mechanisms, and social welfare coexist, they seek to harness the strengths of both traditions. This debate continues to animate contemporary discussions, shaping the policy platforms of parties and the hopes of activists around the world. Of course, the most persistent and formidable challenges to socialism have come from its critics. For as long as socialists have argued for collective ownership and egalitarian distribution, opponents have responded with warnings of inefficiency, stagnation, and the stifling of individual initiative. Critics argue that without the incentives provided by private profit, productivity declines, innovation withers, and bureaucratic inertia sets in. The failures of centrally planned economies, most notably those of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, are frequently invoked as cautionary tales. According to these critics, such systems not only failed economically, but also bred forms of authoritarianism inimical to personal liberty. The suppression of dissent, the expansion of state surveillance, and the lack of political pluralism are all cited as evidence that the pursuit of equality can come at an unacceptable cost to freedom. Socialists have responded to these critiques in a variety of ways. Some acknowledge the historical failures of particular regimes, but argue that these do not invalidate the broader principles of socialism. Instead, they contend, the lesson is to avoid the pitfalls of excessive centralization and to place democracy, both political and economic, at the heart of socialist practice. Others suggest that the inefficiencies and injustices attributed to socialism are not inherent to it, but arise from the specific conditions of their implementation, including external pressures and internal distortions. This ongoing exchange has forced socialists to grapple with difficult questions. How can incentives be structured to encourage creativity and hard work? What safeguards are needed to prevent the concentration of power in the hands of a bureaucratic elite? Can collective ownership coexist with personal autonomy and dissent? Despite these challenges, socialism has demonstrated a remarkable capacity for adaptation and renewal. While the end of the Cold War and the collapse of several state socialist regimes prompted some to declare the project finished, the subsequent decades have witnessed a resurgence of interest, especially among younger generations. This renewed appeal is often rooted in dissatisfaction with the outcomes of neoliberal capitalism, widening economic inequality, precarious work, and the erosion of social safety nets. For many, socialism offers a vocabulary for articulating these grievances and imagining alternative futures. The movement's flexibility has allowed it to accommodate a wide range of interpretations, from democratic socialism and market socialism to more radical or decentralized forms. This diversity is not a sign of weakness but of vitality, allowing socialism to respond to the particular needs and aspirations of different societies and moments. The debates of the present day often turn on moral and ethical questions. What does justice require in a world marked by vast disparities of wealth and power? How should society balance the claims of equality and freedom, solidarity and individuality? In these discussions, socialism is frequently contrasted with capitalism, not only as an economic system but as a vision of the good life. Proponents argue that only by guaranteeing substantive equality and social protection can individuals flourish and participate meaningfully in collective decision-making. Critics, for their part, warn that such guarantees may come at the expense of personal responsibility and initiative. These arguments are often played out in debates about the appropriate scope of the welfare state, the regulation of markets, and the extent of public versus private ownership. Underlying these contemporary controversies are questions that have haunted socialism since its inception. The calculation debate, for instance, remains unresolved. Can a modern, complex economy be guided by democratic planning rather than market forces? Advances in information technology and data analysis have breathed new life into old arguments, suggesting the possibility of more sophisticated forms of coordination. Yet, the challenge of balancing efficiency, responsiveness, and democratic participation persists. Similarly, the relationship between socialism and democracy is the subject of intense scrutiny. While many socialists insist that democracy is both a means and an end, others worry about the risk of majoritarianism or the suppression of dissent. The compatibility of socialism with globalized economies, characterized by cross-border flows of capital, labor, and goods, raises further questions about the feasibility and desirability of national versus international strategies. Importantly, socialism's internationalist tradition endures. Across the world, movements and parties continue to adapt socialist principles to local realities and contemporary issues. In Latin America, Europe, Africa, and Asia, activists draw on the language of solidarity and collective responsibility to confront challenges ranging from poverty and inequality to climate change and migration. The flexibility of socialist thought allows it to inspire experiments in participatory budgeting, cooperative enterprises, and new forms of social protection. In this sense, socialism is less a fixed blueprint than an evolving tradition, one that seeks to reinterpret its foundational values in light of new facts and experiences. The legacy of Marx, Engels, and other foundational thinkers remains powerful, shaping the terms of contemporary debate. Their insistence on analyzing the structures of power and the dynamics of economic life continues to inform critiques of capitalism and proposals for reform. Yet, socialism today is not bound by any single doctrine. Instead, it is characterized by a plurality of approaches, each grappling with the enduring questions of justice, equality, and the good society. The 21st century has presented socialism with both new opportunities and fresh challenges. Rising economic inequality, the intensifying crisis of climate change, and widespread dissatisfaction with the promises of neoliberal capitalism have all contributed to its renewed relevance. For some, socialism offers a way to imagine a world where basic needs are met, where work is dignified, and where the burdens and benefits of economic life are shared more fairly. For others, it serves as a warning, a reminder of the dangers of utopian ambition and the complexities of social engineering. What is clear is that socialism's significance endures, not as a settled doctrine, but as a living tradition of critique and aspiration. Its debates, both internal and external, are not signs of failure but of engagement with the real difficulties of building a just society. The movement's capacity to reflect, to learn from its own history, and to adapt to changing circumstances is a testament to its philosophical depth and practical ambition. As we look to the future, the questions raised by socialism remain as urgent as ever. How should we organize our economies and societies to promote justice and human flourishing? What balance should we strike between individual freedom and collective responsibility? Can we build institutions that are both efficient and democratic, both fair and free? These are not questions with easy answers, but they are questions that socialism has helped to keep alive in public debate. In doing so, it continues to offer both a challenge and an invitation to imagine, to argue, and perhaps to build a better world.